Hello everybody, it is I, the DnD Doge, who reads the cringiest tabletop RPG stories so you don't have to. Everybody remembers their first time. And by that, I mean first time experiencing D&D or any other tabletop RPG. I'm sure for most, it was a great experience that birthed a new hobby that they still enjoy today. Though, for some, it can be a test to one's mental fortitude. Speaking of which, everyone who likes, comments, and subscribes right now will get a bardic inspiration to help protect against the psychic damage that I'm sure is coming our way with these next stories. So let's hop right in. My first and last session, by Reddit user Faye Zena. This is a lot milder than other people's stories here, but I still wanted to talk about it because I never have before, and it might put that memory to rest. It was a couple years ago, and I had joined a new WoW guild to run dungeons and raid with them. The guild was very large, but well organized, and even though not everyone knew everyone, the people I did know, I got along with very well. One day, I saw a post in our guild's forum inviting people to join a weekly tabletop online group. I had done forum roleplays for much of my childhood and wanted to get into tabletop for a while, so I applied, clearly stating that I was a first-time player. The DM accepted the application, and before session 0, we spent about an hour to go over the basics and creating my character. Just your very simple basic human, with the only special thing being her being a person who could infuse objects with magic. I don't remember what they're called. Her backstory was very simple, and her reasons for being in the town where the group was meant to meet was that she wanted to find someone to teach her more about magical objects, as suggested by the DM. Everything was great. I was so happy with my character and very excited, so when the others joined, we explained our characters and everyone was happy with the party. So, to start us off, DM wanted to just roleplay how the group met, and everyone was fine with that. All our characters arrived somewhere in the city. For example, the rogue was walking through a dark alley, and the barbarian arrived by a ship, etc. My character walked in from the city gate, looking for the expert tinkerer that she wanted to visit. It was fine, we were having fun, but while the rest of the group met up at the tavern almost immediately, the DM focused on my character and made her experience misfortune. First, an NPC emptied a bedpan over her while she was walking to the tinkerer's shop, covering her with feces. The other 3 characters at that point had started talking and getting to know each other, and I wanted to join in, but the DM reminded me that my character was so gross and had such a bad smell that no one would let her in anywhere. So I asked the DM if there was a bathhouse, and there was. So of course, my character visits that to clean herself up before meeting the tinkerer and then joining the others. When taking a bath, the DM made a street urchin steal all of her clothes and what little money she had. Meanwhile, the other characters had decided to stick together for a while to take on some mercenary work or whatnot. Jumping out of the bath, my character now had no clothes, so she grabbed a towel and ran after the urchin. But the urchin was gone, so she just lost all money and all clothes, including her instruments. So I assumed our first little quest would be to find my character's stuff, and said that I wanted to visit the tavern to initiate that, but the DM said I should meet the tinkerer first. Maybe he had some clothes. I assumed it was a hint and agreed, so she goes to the shop, half naked mind you, but the shop is locked, and looking in, it seems to be empty and nothing seems to be touched. So my character asked the people outside of the shop when the expert tinkerer would be back, and they said that he died. So no money, no materials, no clothes, and now no master. My plan was to meet up with the group and ask them for help, but the DM said that I needed clothes first, or my character would be very embarrassed. So basically, she had to beg random NPCs for clothes, and finally got a mantle. Meanwhile, the rest of the group had received their first mercenary work from the innkeeper. The actual quest we would start in the next session. It was some sword that we were meant to get back. At that point, my character was completely separate from the group. Never met them, never saw them, nothing. The group had fun while I was struggling against the DM, who threw as many stones in my character's way as he could, including literally. The NPCs would tease her, for example, tell her to get out, and so on. There were smaller things as well. For example, the aforementioned stones she stepped on and ended up bleeding from, taking minor damage. At this point, the rest of the group wanted to meet up as well, so we quickly discussed and agreed that they would go shopping and my character would meet them there, and they would pay for new clothes, which sounded like the perfect plan. Except, the DM said that because my character was new in town, she did not know where the shops were and had to ask people. So she asked for the way, and an NPC told her. She followed the instruction and got lost. At that point, it had been 2 hours, and I was just kind of rolling my eyes and said that my character would just follow the street. But then, the road got smaller and smaller and ended up being just a dark alley, in which a dark figure was standing. The group was groaning, and one of the other players said, quote, "Can we just finally group up and go?" And the DM relented. The dark figure turned out to be an NPC who told her where the shops were. But by then, the group had already moved on, because what else were they supposed to do during all the turns it took me to get to the shop? And was at the harbor, chartering a boat. So the DM pushed me to go to the harbor as well. He said, since my character now needed money and clothes, she would find a job on the boat as a deck scrubber and whatnot. My character arrived at the ship, and the session ended on a cliffhanger, on whether or not she would get the job on the boat. At that point, I had spent a good 2 hours following a completely different storyline, being kept as separate from the group as possible, and that made a strong impression on me. I felt as though the DM was trying to keep me out of the way of everyone else, so that I wouldn't bother them with my bad beginner RP. But they didn't seem to mind, and besides, I was RPing pretty much the same as the others, because, while tabletop is new to me, roleplay as a whole is not. I thought maybe he didn't want me to take part at all, but I noticed no aversion in the time before the group met up. Maybe I did something wrong. I felt terrible, and before the next planned session, I wrote him a forum message telling him that it wasn't for me, and I would go raiding with the guild instead. And that was my first and last D&D session. Found out about this subreddit from a buddy who I'm playing a different MMO with, because the topic of tabletop came up, and I told the story in a haha, isn't that funny, kind of jokey way. But I'm not gonna lie, it did bother me a bit. Thought it might fit here. If it doesn't, please tell me. Jeez, that sounded like a horrible way to introduce a new player to tabletop RPGs. It almost seems like that DM had it out for OP, and didn't want a newbie at his table. And instead of just telling OP that, he decided to make it the worst experience ever. Which is really messed up, because, by the sounds of it, it ruined the concept of playing tabletop RPGs for OP. Hopefully, OP will find a better DM to play with, and give D&D another shot in the future. Let's move on to the next story. First Time Player versus Veteran DM by Reddit user Done and Barely Here. Okay, so this may be a confusing post. Honestly, it was a confusing campaign, but please, bear with me. Also, there are mentions of not safe for work stuff, so heads up. People involved. Me, a non-magic fighter. The DM, Druid, my close friend, and Vampire, I think, close friend's girlfriend. So, Druid invited me to play D&D with DM, Vampire, and another of our mutual friends. I'd never played before, and was hesitant because I'm not good at math. Really has nothing to do with anything, just thought I'd say it. Anyways, I sat in on a session to try to understand the playstyle, DM style, and all of that shebang. It wasn't like the D&D that I knew about. It was homebrew and post-apocalyptic. I noticed that all of the players, including DM's many NPCs, were pretty heavy magic users, and I'm not saying that that's a bad thing at all, though it did affect how I built my character. I decided to choose an Eldarin fighter that refused to use magic. He also had an edgy backstory. I know that's the thing that turns people off of things, but I was new, and I figured it worked. Once I got my character built, I was thrown into the game. It was pretty fun at first, and I went through a few sessions with no complaints. Well, there was one slight one. DM wanted to have a session every night, and didn't like it if a player called off if they, quote, didn't have a good excuse. He also informed us that if we ever had a complaint or didn't like something he did, he'd tell us to leave. Honestly, kind of funny since he'd recently moved into Druid's house. Probably about 10 sessions later, I started taking notes. Shit got super confusing, and I felt like I was forgetting or missing things more and more, and it turns out I wasn't the only one. In the same session, the NPCs, who were, now I know, were more DM player characters or whatever, decided that I would be the unofficial leader of the group because of my fighter's military background. I wasn't entirely comfortable with that, since I was new and all. I kept everyone alive, but it sure as hell seemed like the DM was trying to fuck me over in every situation, which he later told me that, no matter what I'd done, it would have been the same outcome. I'm skipping a lot of campaign story stuff, but if I tried to explain that, I'd be here for years. Later, after helping patch someone up during battle, since I was allowed to have a small med pack in case the other players were too busy to use magic, I was assigned medic, mostly by the DM, which isn't how I really wanted to play the character. I mean, hell, I chose fighter. This DM was also hella gross. Anytime a girl would join the game, they'd quit within a few sessions, other than vampire, because of DM. DM had quite a few NPCs that were really sexual and crass, and would do things that the players weren't comfortable with. If anyone complained, he'd stop, but only for so long. My wife, who was just a friend at the time, actually played one session with us, and this happened to them too. DM also never had much of a storyline, though he seemed to think he did. I don't really have a problem with open world stuff, but damn, say it's open world. Don't say you've got this awesome storyline when it makes no sense. This is where I started to get tired of playing every fucking night for upwards of 4 to 6 hours. It felt like nothing I did, or anyone else did, moved the story along at all. So I started giving him some suggestions, as I enjoy writing stories. Problem is, anything I said, he would directly use it and act as if he came up with it himself. I didn't confront him about it because, again, I was a new player, and I'm not the most confrontational guy. There were quite a few times when I would ask him if something had a connection to a past situation, which is information that would most likely be known as my fighter was going through multiple confidential files. He said no, there wasn't anything interesting, but then the next session, suddenly there was a connection. Me and the other players started talking about DM a lot and came up with the same complaints. Druid, who was always around when I was giving suggestions and asking questions to DM, told me that I was practically making up the storyline and all of that for DM. And I mean, it kind of made sense. The guy ran sessions every night and did little to no planning between, so I tested it. I didn't give any suggestions or ask any questions. And yeah, the story fell apart pretty much immediately. We never finished the campaign, as DM grossed out and pissed off every one of the players, including a friend he brought in at one point who had apparently played with him before. One last thing I want to point out. DM said he'd been DMing for 15 years. Honestly, I don't know how true that is, but he nearly turned me off of D&D. Luckily, I've learned more about the game and still do enjoy it. Edit. Completely forgot until my wife brought it up. But DM had a huge breeding kick or something. Because at some point, every one of the female characters were pregnant, with multiples. None of this happened with the consent of the players. Apparently, it was up to the dice. So, that DM claimed to be DMing for 15 years? Somehow, I kind of doubt that. Also, don't get me wrong, I love D&D, but playing every single night for 4 to 5 hours? I never thought I would say this, but that is just way too much D&D. Granted, it did sound like bad D&D as well. And what the hell is with all these DMs making female characters pregnant? I swear, this is like the 4th story I put on this channel with this theme. What is going on here? Is there some sort of conspiracy? Is the Illuminati involved? I better not dig too deep. Though, what do you think? Thankfully, it sounds like OP still enjoys D&D to this day. Let's move on to the next story. Horrid in Hindsight by Reddit user Evil Tiny Wolf. This is the story of my first exposure to D&D. I hadn't enjoyed the game at the time, but it did give me a few funny stories to tell. So it took me quite a while to realize just how much of a horror story it was. Names have been changed, as is tradition for this place. When I was in high school, I did community theater. My mom volunteered to paint the sets, and we had season tickets, so she was very good friends with the director and her husband. Unless there was a deliberate casting call for children, I was typically the youngest actor on set, and the only minor involved with most productions. Theater was where I met Jim. Jim was in college and one of the people closest to me in age. My mom loved him, so I was trusted to go just about anywhere, at any hour, as long as Jim was involved. He figured out rather quickly that I was a nerd, so he asked if I'd be interested in playing D&D with him and his group. They were doing a special Halloween one-shot before starting a new campaign, so perfect time to test out to see if a new player might be interested. Everyone would be making new characters, and I'd have no obligation to go again if I didn't like it. Jim had already told the DM that I was a minor, and that I didn't like horror movies, but he'd been assured that the plot of the one-shot would be a mystery, and I'd be free to join. I was down. Halloween night, Jim picked me up at my house, and we drove the hour into the boonies to his DM's house. DM was a much older gentleman named Jack. His wife, Anne, would be playing as well. Since we were early, Jack and Jim helped me set up a character sheet. Jack explained what everything on the sheet meant, and we put together a pirate. Since it was a one-shot and my first game, Jack let me have a pet too, so I made a rat. Jack had been intending for me to have a parrot to go with the pirate theme, but he was indulgent and let me keep the rat. The last player to be joining the group for the night was Bart, the problem player, who would be the bane of my experience. Jack explained the rules of the one-shot. Player versus player would be allowed, even though he didn't normally, and he'd be pulling from source books that he didn't normally allow at his table. Meaning, there would be new monsters for his regular players, justifying new or weird player classes, and just in general, having fun with some new rules. Right off the bat, Bart was annoyed both in the fact that I was a pirate and that I had a pet. Since the game hadn't started yet, Jack told him that he could change his class or take a pet as well. Bart didn't take him up on it. He was just annoyed that I had. We start the game. Everyone introduces their characters and very basic reasons as to why we were out on an adventure before ending up in our current circumstance. Not even 10 minutes after getting our first clue on the mystery, Bart announces he's slitting my throat and rolls his dice. It was immediately fatal to a level 1 character. He also made an attack on the rat. Jack ruled that the rat lost an eye, but got away. I was furious, but Jack had said PvP was allowed for the one-shot. Realizing no one was agreeing with me on it, I bit my tongue and went with Jack into the kitchen to roll a new character. I made a fighter and put as much into health as I could, with the hope of surviving more than one hit. An hour into the night, we find our first magic item. After some discussion, Jim and Anne agree it worked best for my fighter. I add it to my sheet, then Bart kills my fighter and adds the item to his sheet. Jim protests and calls Bart out that he only killed me because the group didn't give him the item. But once again, no one is actually doing anything about Bart killing an ally. I don't even remember what character 3 was. I just let Jim make it because I was no longer invested. Anne's character got a sex scene, so the rest of us were kicked out to the backyard while Jack and Anne role-played it out. Bart commented that the scene must have been more explicit than normal for Jack to ask everyone to leave for it, which told me them actually playing out sex scenes at the table must have been at least somewhat expected. Now, as an adult, I think sex scenes should just be fade to black, but at 16, I was extremely uncomfortable that this married couple apparently role-played out their sex scenes in front of their friends with enough regularity that it warranted comment as being odd for the party to be asked to stand outside for it. During our short break of standing outside, I asked Jim if we could leave yet. Jim immediately went back inside the house. A few minutes later, he came back out with a new character sheet. While he was inside, he had made a request of Jack. When everyone came back inside, I would no longer be playing my third character. I'd be playing my first character's pet rat. The rat would be revealed to have necromancer levels and would have used his dark powers to bring my pirate back as a zombie that he'd pilot like a Gundam. I'd have the rat's necromancer spells, as well as my pirate's level 1 skills. He successfully convinced me to finish the game, and I even drew a picture of an eye patch wearing rat riding a zombie version of my pirate into combat on the back of the sheet, as the sex scene took way too long. The fact I had time to put together the character and draw that picture is not a point in the game's favor. Bart was livid when we went back inside and he met my rat with a zombie pirate character. He tried to kill me again, but this time Jim and Anne actually defended my character, and Jack didn't let him. We played for another hour and wrapped up without getting even remotely close to solving the mystery. On the way home, Jim asked if I'd want to join their new campaign. I told him no. I found out later that while Jim had warned Jack that I was a minor, no one had told Bart. He told me later that if he had realized I was a kid, he wouldn't have targeted me so hard. His logic had been that I was new to DnD and would be easier to fight in PvP than the other two. It wasn't much of an apology, so I didn't accept it. While I remained friends with Jim, I never agreed to another game night with him or his group. I was eventually coaxed into playing other tabletop games by different friends in a different state. It was 10 years before anyone was able to convince me to try D&D again. While I am very invested in D&D these days, I still have no interest in ever touching 3rd edition or 3.5e again. I know some people love it, but I'm never going back to it. Well, I always hate to hear when a bad experience turns someone off of tabletop RPGs. It shouldn't have mattered that Bart didn't realize that OP was only 15 at the time. Targeting a player just because they are new and would be easier to beat in a fight of PvP is a real dick move. Then to do it again, and then a third time, no wonder OP lost interest in it for 10 years. Thankfully, it sounds like OP is now enjoying the game after giving it a second chance. Was your first time with Dungeons & Dragons a bad experience? If so, how long did it take you to try it out again afterward? Do you have a story that you would like to be read on the channel by this doggo? If so, feel free to post it in the comments, on the channel subreddit, or even just at me on Twitter. As always, I appreciate all of you, and may all of your games be awesome and fun. unlike the ones in these stories. Until next time.